hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord and Redeemer. Amen. A Catholic bishop was on his way to the Vatican. He saw a large crowd of people gathered in St. Peter's Square. So he said to his driver, "Take me over because I want to see what's happening amongst that crowd of people." He went over and he saw Jesus walking towards the Vatican. "Oh my goodness, it's Jesus. It must be the second coming," he said. "I thought the coming would be a bit louder." So he says to his driver, "You better take me quickly to the Vatican." So he goes on to the Vatican and he dashes up the stairs to the Pope's chambers. And at the doors of the chambers stands a little Polish cardinal. "I want to see the Pope now," says the bishop. The little man says, "Well, he's busy. How about 4 o'clock this afternoon?" "This is the second coming," says the bishop. "I need to see the Pope." So he dashes in, and the Pope stood peacefully gazing out of the window. "What are you doing?" asked the Pope. "Can't you see I'm resting?" "Jesus is coming," said the man. "Jesus is coming. It's the second coming." "Strange," said the Pope. "I thought it would be a bit more noisy than that." So the Pope then slowly and gently walks over to his desk and takes out a piece of paper and starts to write. "What are you doing?" says the bishop. The Pope looks at him and says, "I know Jesus is coming. Look busy." I want you to hold that story because Jesus will come again. At the heart of our message and our passage today is the truth that Jesus will come again, that there will be a victory of God over everything in this world that we think can't be beaten. Hold on to that truth. The key thing for us also today is, how are we going to be found when he does come again? But let's do a few bits of basic work before we leap into the passage. We're back in Daniel. But we're also back in time. Because if you notice, we closed chapter 6, verse 28, noting that it was the reign of Cyrus the Persian. And we saw, didn't we, various kings came and various kings went. But we opened 7 by saying in the first year of Belshazzar, king of Babylon. We're going back in time. There's no real significance to that, just to note that Daniel has now decided that the time has come to write down the things that he experienced as he was being faithful to God, how God entrusted him with visions during that time of faithful service. We also changed the type of material we're looking at. We've been looking at historical material up until now. We're now into apocalyptic material. And we're going to spend a bit of time with that this year. We're going to be looking at the book of Revelation as well this year. But most people think of apocalyptic literature as quite scary. Actually, it's not. Apocalyptic literature is a message of hope. It's a message that actually, although we are God's suffering people, and although the world appears to be chaotic and out of control, there is a God in heaven who will and is bringing about judgment and salvation. So we shouldn't be scared of apocalyptic literature. But let's have a look at the images that we've got. So Daniel's on his bed, and some people might suggest he's had a bad meal because he's seeing some horrendous things. We've got some real Babylonian, Assyrian images here. The sea and the four winds and the churning up and the great beast, they're all images that you could easily link back to the Leviathan, which appears in Babylonian literature. And if you look at the four great beasts, you've got a lion that stands on its hind legs with wings of an eagle. Go to the British Museum, you will see beasts that look very similar to that in some of the Babylonian carvings. You've got a bear with things between its teeth. You've got a bit of blood and gore. What's at the heart of this? Should we be getting all worried about which of these beasts relate to which kingdom? No, I want you to understand the main thing that's being driven home here is that these kingdoms, these beasts are evil. They're not just evil in what they do, they're evil in how they look. Their very being is the sense of evil which reigns in the hearts of man. This is Friday the 13th with knobs on. These things are primed and ready to pounce. They are dripping with blood. They are deadly. They are speedy. They have killing power. So we establish the fact that the kingdoms of this world are, at one level, inherently evil. But then we have the fourth beast, terrifying and frightening, verse 7, and very powerful. This isn't just nature. This is a mixture of man-made terror, these iron teeth and, as we see later, bronze claws. This is the worst that the world can throw at us. This is terror raging. And it seems at that point that all is lost. But it's interesting, isn't it, that we go from this image of evil reigning in the world immediately in verse 9 to the Ancient of Days taking his seat. And look at the contrast. We've seen all this terror, and then we see a man whose clothing is as white as snow, the hair of his head as white as wool. In contrast to the evil, we have purity. In contrast to the darkness and the hopelessness, we have the purity of God. The throne, in verse 9, is flaming with fire, and its wheels were ablaze, and a river of fire is flowing, coming out from before him, verse 10. That's meant to tell us this God is powerful. This God has power. And then, unlike the beasts who work on their own, in verse 10, 10,000 upon 1,000 attend upon him. This is the God who can call upon thousands, an army of saints. This is a God who has power. So we have the contrast, dark, light, evil, good. And God doesn't wait, does he? As he watches, the beast is still boasting, even though God's there. And then God destroys it utterly. He doesn't just kill it and leave it to rot. It's burned and destroyed and cleared away from before the face of Daniel. That is what God will do. And the world needs to understand that its power is limp in the face of God's justice. I'm sure you've all read that wonderful tweet that appeared over Christmas. North Korean leader Kim Jong-un just stated that the nuclear button is on his desk at all times. Will somebody from this depleted and food-starved regime please inform him that I too have a nuclear button, but it is much bigger and more powerful than his, and my button works. Who wrote that? Donald, our good friend Donald Trump. The world likes to think it has power. The world likes to think it can do what it will. The world likes to think it can crush the church and Christianity, but time and time again it will find that it comes up against the Ancient of Days. And the Ancient of Days will have his way. It struck me how lame the world is when I read the story of Hei Wu. As Hei Wu looked at her husband's, as she walked into her husband's prison cell in North Korea, she couldn't believe her eyes. The man before her was hardly recognizable from the torture he'd suffered for being a Christian. He covertly slipped something into her hand that would change her life forever. A little note, a profession of his faith. Later, she began to follow Christ, and she ended up in a prison cell of her own. And despite being faced with starvation and torture, she realized that she'd been given the opportunity in prison to share the gospel with those around her. Before long, a number of women met with her. She began to help them to place their faith in Jesus Christ. They started to gather for secret fellowship in the prison toilet, the most unlikely of places, where the women sang the praises of God, prayed and shared the Bible verses. She was lucky. She was released from prison and eventually escaped to South Korea, where she was able to share her testimony. But even when the world thinks it's won, even when North Korea thinks it can oppose God and do its worst and put Christians to suffer in prison camps, God wins. We need to remember this when we stare in wonder at the world. We let the world capture our hearts and minds. We're a bit like Charlie in the chocolate factory. We go in and the world's wonderful. It's filled with glories, but just below those glories and those wonders is evil. The world is inherently an evil place. It disobeys God. It is a place which will devour us if we let it. And then we see the new age coming. Daniel doesn't understand this because, of course, Daniel is not sure who this Son of Man is. In verse 13, in my vision at night I looked, and there before me was one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. We now know, don't we, that that was Jesus Christ. We know that what's coming here is the early days of salvation. The moment when God will win the battle. When the book will be opened, our sins revealed, and Christ will save us. I want you to also note that it's the image of somebody who is the Son of Man. It's important that we understand that he is like a man, but he is given God's power. And we sometimes think, well, we can quite understand why the Jews expected a soldier on a throne, on a horse with a big sword, can't we? Because the image here is we've got the Son of Man coming into the presence of the Ancient of Days, given authority, glory, and sovereign power over all the nations. Verse 14, his dominion is for everlasting and will not pass away. You can quite understand why the Jews thought there was going to be this great king coming. But actually the key is that he is the Son of Man. He is man-like. And the first coming had to be as it was. We've just celebrated Christmas when the Son of Man came. When this Son of Man came, it could have been fiery chariots and swords, but it wasn't. It was a stable, which led to a cross. But he still had the power, didn't he? He still had the authority. This is a man who forgave sins and raised the dead. He's no less the Son of Man. Remember, this message has been given in the time of Belshazzar, when people were under pressure, people were persecuted. They were living in a fear of what the world might do to them. And this is a reminder for them that God is on the throne, and the world might come and the world will go and kingdoms will rise and fall, and yet God is constant. And we need to hear that in the 21st century, because we as Christians look at the liberal West and we think it's won. The relativism of the West, the pressure, the ever-growing pressure of the LGBT movement. We see family falling apart. We see marriage under attack. We see China rising in the East. We see a breakdown of society. And we have the temptation to just throw our hands up and go, Sileby's become secular. Why are we even bothering? Well, we're bothering because the King of Heaven is seated on the throne, and the battle has not been lost. The battle has in fact been won. We need to remember time and time again what Paul said to the Romans. What shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? What a passage to take into 2018. If God is for us, who can be against us? How do we know this? Because the Romans passage goes on to tell us he gave us Jesus Christ. And it ends with that amazing passage from 37 onwards. Knowing all these things, we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in creation will be able to separate us from the love of God. That's what this passage is telling us. And then Daniel, having seen all this, goes to the angel because he's troubled, and he sees all these people around him. He wants some help. And he wants to know particularly about the fourth beast with its horns that will devour the earth. and will make war against the saints. It will only fall on the final day of judgment. Now, I could spend a lot of time, waste your time this morning, trying to work out who this fourth beast is. There's been a lot of time and very clever writing about whether this is Rome, the Assyrians, whoever it is. But the angel isn't concerned to tell Daniel who it is. The angel is it's more on the angel's heart to tell him that the beast will come and the saints will be under pressure, but that the Ancient of Days will come and there will be an end to this time of persecution. What we need to take away from this, rather than trying to look at who was this beast supposed to represent, we need to understand there will be time coming when Christians will be persecuted. We've known that for generations. And it will be a time when those who lead us and those who rule the earth will ditch everything of God. They'll alter the calendar. They'll leave it all behind. They will persecute us in a way we've never seen. But they will lose. I was shocked to read that in the last year, in 2016, because the number's not out for 2017, 90,000 Christians died for their faith. We are the most persecuted religious group in the world. Every day, a Christian dies every 6 minutes. Every day of the year, one Christian dies every 6 minutes for their faith. That's down on 2015, when 105,000 Christians died for their faith. Where did they die? Well, in 2016, most of them died at the hands of Islamic extremists, of ISIS, and others were killed by state and non-state persecution. The Huffington Post reported that Christianity is facing total elimination in its biblical homeland. Between half and 2/3 of Christians in the Middle East have departed or been killed in the last 50 years. The article attributes intolerance and violence towards Christians to the rising power of Islam, particularly in the Middle East. Some of the oppression is government sanctioned and some government permitted. Most of it is government ignored. We as Christians live in a world in the West where we think we should have an easy ride of it. And God will always keep us safe. No, God doesn't promise that. God asks us to be faithful in serving Him and sharing the gospel. The aim of the passage is to keep you focused in the midst of the mess on the God of heaven and the final judgment. And where am I in preparing for it? A Bible study group was discussing the unforeseen possibility of their sudden death. Great thing to discuss in a Bible study group. The leader said, "We will all die someday, and none of us know when, but if we did, what would we all do to prepare ourselves for that inevitable event?" Everybody shook their heads in agreement that they needed to do something. Then the leader said, "So what would you do if you only had 4 weeks of life remaining before your death and the great judgment day?" And one gentleman said, "I'd go into the community and I'd minister the gospel to all those who've not yet accepted the Lord into their lives." Very good. And the group all chanted and said it was good. One lady spoke up and said enthusiastically, I dedicate all my remaining time to serving God, my family, and my church, and my fellow man with greater conviction." "That's wonderful," said the group. But there was a chap in the far corner who didn't seem to be part of the conversation, and he finally spoke up and said, "I would go to my mother-in-law's house for 4 weeks." Everybody looked very puzzled by this, and the group leader said, "Why your mother-in-law's house?" He said, "Because it would make it the longest 4 weeks of my life." What are you going to do? What am I going to do in preparation? Because judgment's coming. And I tell you, when Christ opens the books that are mentioned in verse 10, everything will be revealed. And I'm not looking forward to that day. Because when God opens the book and looks at the life of Duncan Beet, it won't be all roses. I'll need that Son of Man who came and died for me. I'll need him more than I ever needed him before. Because when the books are opened, all the disgusting, terrible, horrible nature of what we are will be laid bare. And we will need the Son of Man more than we've ever needed him. Our job is to prepare. Not be worried about our beasts. I don't know what your beast is. It might be fear of something big and global. But these beasts can also be personal. They can be anxiety. They can be stress. They can be living with a rude or uncaring partner. They can be living in an unhappy marriage. They can be living with the fear of what's going to happen tomorrow with your job. They can be the fear of global nuclear war and Donald Trump's big red button. Could be a terrible boss. But as you live in the here and now, remember to look at the throne of heaven, to keep your eyes fixed, not on the here and now, but on the reality that is to come. I want to close with the story of Samuel Rutherford. Samuel Rutherford is a Scottish priest, and he kept his eyes fixed ultimately on the throne of heaven. He was born in the 1600s, and in 1643 he left Scotland for London and was one of the Scottish commissioners at the Westminster Assembly. He remained in London for 4 years, and he published 5 major books. And in 1644, he wrote a book called the Leics, where he denied the limitless sovereignty belonging to the king and said that actually the crown was bestowed by the voluntary consent of the people. He also wrote in that book about the grace of God. In 1647, he resumed his duties back in Scotland and became rector of the university at St Andrews. When the Restoration came round in 1661, the king ordered that everything that Rutherford had ever written was to be burned. Rutherford himself was imprisoned, and he was due to be brought before Parliament on a charge of treason. He'd never bowed his knee to the state, but had always served his God. And he replied to the warrant for his arrest, because he was very ill at that time. I have got summons already before a superior judge. I behove to answer to my first summons before I come to you. If I die, I will go to a place where few kings and great folk come. He died before he could answer the charge before Parliament. We need to remember that our first concern is to serve God. Is to serve God with our eyes fixed on the throne of heaven, not afraid of the beasts of this world, but living in the reality of our salvation. Because as Matthew 24 tells us, we don't know the day or the hour. Not even the angels know the day or the hour when judgment will come. Our job is not to worry about it. Our job is not to be scared by the beasts of this world, but to have our eyes fixed on the throne room of heaven and to be busy about God's work in the meantime. So let's look to tomorrow and be busy about God's work, seeking to save people for that last day. Because there is a simple and terrible truth. When judgment comes, there will be those who will be saved and those who will be lost. And there may be people that are very dear to us. And our job is to share the gospel with them, so that we all might dwell forever in Emmanuel's land. Amen.